Today, you will learn the story of a family that gathers to celebrate Christmas. But something is missing. A buried secret, an absence that breaks hearts, and an invisible rift that threatens to tear them apart forever. What happens that night will change their lives. Will they find the strength to stay united? The chair at the head of the table is empty. Even so, Raoul drops his jacket over the backrest as if she might appear at any moment. The creak of the wood as it sinks into the seat fills the dining room like an unpleasant echo. Caddy, standing by the table, stares at the wrinkled tablecloth, her fingers clumsily brushing the fabric. In the corner of the living room, the makeshift nativity scene seems poorly placed, lackluster. The baby Jesus, tilted to one side, appears to gaze reproachfully. "This doesn't feel like Christmas," Kello murmurs, breaking the silence with a voice no louder than a whisper. No one responds. Beside her, Frutos drums his fingers on the table. The conversations are fragmented. Raoul mentions the traffic on the way. Tomas asks about the red cabbage. But the air feels heavy, as if words must push through a thick fog to reach the other side. "Why don't we light the fireplace?" Frutos asks suddenly, glancing at the wood stacked in the corner. Caddy flinches, as if the words had struck her physically. She looks around for support, but finds only tired, distant eyes. Finally, she shrugs. "I didn't think it was cold enough," she replies in a faint voice, more to apologize than to justify the decision. "Well, it's cold," insists Frutos, crossing his arms. Raoul exhales, exhausted. "It's just a fireplace. It's not going to change anything." An awkward silence falls over the table. The scraping of cutlery against plates becomes the only sound. From the far end of the table, Rodrigo clears his throat. "I don't know about you, but I think it feels strange not seeing her here." Once again, silence. Everyone avoids looking at him, as if mentioning the absence has opened a wound no one wants to examine closely. The house seems to freeze for a moment, with only the distant ticking of the wall clock filling the void. Finally, Cello looks away, her eyes wet. "She always said this would be her last Christmas," she murmurs, her voice trembling with every word. Raoul snorts, trying to suppress the discomfort. "She said that every year." Elvie, from the other end of the table, laughs nervously. Maybe this time she really knew. Catty, who had remained silent until now, mumbles something unintelligible as she gets up to go to the kitchen. Rodrigo watches her small, stooped figure as she disappears behind the door. Something in the way she walks reflects the tension they are all trying to hide. In the center of the table, the red cabbage dish remains untouched, forgotten among the porcelain plates. The dinner, like the atmosphere, is cold. The conversation seemed doomed to fall apart before it began. The sentences emerged timidly, caught between the mundane and the irrelevant. But then, Callow placed her fork on her plate with a faint clatter that echoed louder than expected. Everyone looked up. "She never placed the baby like that," she said, pointing at the nativity scene with a quick nod of her head. Catty, still standing in the kitchen doorway, slowly turned around, trapped between guilt and confusion. Her face flushed immediately. "I didn't even notice," she stammered. "If you want, I'll fix it." Kelo shook her head, but didn't take her eyes off the misplaced baby Jesus. "It's the same. The point is, it presided over everything. It always presided over everything." The sentence hung in the air, heavy and tangible. Rodrigo cleared his throat from his seat. "Why don't we light the fireplace? She always said it wasn't Christmas Eve without the fire," he suggested. Catty opened her mouth but said nothing. She just shrugged, her gaze falling to the floor. Frutos, with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes, tried to lighten the mood. "And how do you know that if you weren't even here last year?" he joked, though his tone came out more bitter than he had planned. "Because she told me. She told me years ago, Frutos. She always said those things, as if she knew that one day." Rodrigo didn't finish the sentence. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and let out a sigh. From the head of the table, Raoul twirled his fork around his empty plate. She'd been saying it for 20 years, that this Christmas would be her last. She had to be right eventually, didn't she? The comment provoked a faint burst of uncomfortable laughter. Elvie, who had hardly said anything, leaned toward Kelo and placed a hand over hers. "Do you remember how she made the red cabbage? She always said it needed to be sautéed with a touch of garlic. The secret is in the timing," she said, "and no one could ever imitate her." Kelo nodded, her eyes moist. The red cabbage always turned out different, but it always turned out perfect. Everything she did turned out well, even when improvised. The silence returned, denser than before, like a shadow spreading through the room. Rodrigo stood up and, moving slowly, approached the fireplace. He crouched down and began arranging the logs. "I'm going to light it. This year, more than ever, we need the fire." Catty quickly moved forward from the kitchen. "It's not necessary, really. Besides, I don't know if the logs are dry." "Leave it, Catty. I'll take care of it," Rodrigo replied firmly, already striking a match. The flames were slow to catch, but when they did, they illuminated Rodrigo's face with a warm glow that contrasted with the chill of the room. He watched the fire for a few moments and then returned to his seat, though he didn't sit down. "Maybe we should do something else, something she would have liked, something in her honor." Elvie frowned. "In her honor? Like what?" Rodrigo shrugged, but there was something determined in his expression. "We could prepare something special, the red cabbage, or the coffee flan she loved, or just remember the good things." Raoul dropped his fork with a sharp clatter. "We don't need to turn this dinner into a memorial. It's enough just being here without her." The comment hit like a bucket of cold water. Catty, still holding a plate in her hands, pressed her lips together, fearing something else might break, besides the silence. Kelo looked at Rodrigo with a certain sadness, but said nothing. The flames crackled softly in the fireplace, illuminating everyone's faces. No one seemed willing to take the next step, though they all knew the emptiness they felt wouldn't disappear on its own. Rodrigo climbed to the attic with slow steps, the cold wood creaking under his bare feet. He had only been up there a couple of times in his life, always following her, who would go in search of the boxes with Christmas decorations. Now, in the dim light, the place felt different. Not as chaotic as he remembered, but definitely more disorganized, as if time had altered it in her absence. He turned on the hanging bulb, whose light barely reached one corner. He was looking for something simple, some paper to kindle the fire, but his eyes stopped on a cardboard box labeled Christmas. The lid was loose, as if someone had opened it recently. Driven by a mix of curiosity and nostalgia, he removed the lid and froze. Inside the box was a small collection of objects that seemed insignificant, but, to Rodrigo, were fragments of a life that no longer existed. The photographs were neatly stacked, showing scenes of past Christmases, the decorated tree, Jair holding a tray of nougats, the younger siblings fighting over a gift. On one side of the box, wrapped in yellowed white paper, was the ornament she always placed at the center of the table, a small angel with crystal wings. Rodrigo held it in his hands for a moment, feeling that the object weighed much more than it should. Then his fingers stumbled upon a sealed envelope, which seemed out of place among the photographs and ornaments. He opened it carefully and pulled out a letter written in her precise handwriting. The paper smelled of lavender, just like the closets of his childhood. He read it quickly, his heart racing with each line. Without saying a word, Rodrigo returned to the dining room. Everyone looked up as he entered, carrying the box in his arms, their expressions shifting between curiosity and discomfort. He placed the box on a chair by the fireplace and pulled out the angel first, setting it carefully in the center of the table. "Do you remember this? She always said this angel was her favorite, that if it wasn't on the table, it wasn't Christmas." Callow let out a small sigh, her eyes filling with tears. She always made sure to place it just right. Even if it didn't match anything, there it was. Raoul frowned and crossed his arms. "And what's this for? We don't need to dust off old things to remember her." Rodrigo didn't respond. Instead, he took out the photographs and began spreading them across the table. Kello picked up one of them with trembling hands. In the image, she was leaning next to a Christmas tree, smiling with the ridiculous hat Raoul used to wear to make her laugh. "I don't understand why we're doing this now," Raoul muttered, standing up from the table. His voice had a sharp edge that cut through the atmosphere. "Do you think this will change anything? That bringing these things back will bring her back?" "It's not about bringing her back, Raoul," Rodrigo replied calmly, though his eyes shone with an intensity that suggested he was struggling to maintain control. "It's about remembering who she was, and what she did for all of us." Rodrigo took the letter and held it in the air for everyone to see. "This is for us. She wrote it last year, after Christmas." Cathy brought a hand to her chest, unable to take her eyes off the envelope. Rodrigo opened it carefully and began to read aloud. "Dear family, if you're reading this, it means that this year I'm not with you, but I don't want it to be a sad moment. Christmas is for celebrating what we have, not for mourning what we've lost. This year and every year after, I ask you not to forget what it means to be together, because in the end, that's the only thing that matters. Take care of each other, just as I took care of all of you." The silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. Kello wiped her tears with a napkin, while Elvie stared into the fireplace, lost in thought. Raoul, standing by the table, turned toward the window, avoiding everyone's gaze. "Took care?" Kello asked, her voice breaking. What did she mean by that? Rodrigo pulled another letter from the box, this one addressed to him. He extended it toward Raoul, though the gesture seemed aimed at everyone. She didn't say it often, but she did everything she could to keep us together. She paid Frutos's house debts without anyone knowing. She helped Elvie move when she had problems, and she never stopped worrying about how you were, Raoul, even when you were so distant with her. Raoul spun around abruptly, his eyes flashing with anger. So what? Now we were all a charity project for her? Is that what you want us to remember? Rodrigo stepped forward, facing him directly. No, Raoul, I want you to remember that, despite everything, she never stopped loving us, even when we didn't deserve it. Elvie took the letter from Rodrigo's hands and began reading it silently. Her expression shifted, moving from disbelief to deep sadness. Caddy, with her hands still clasped together, lifted her gaze to the angel in the center of the table. "Maybe," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "we should think less about what we're missing and more about what she left us." The fireplace crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. No one spoke for a moment, but in the silence her words seemed to echo louder than ever. The air in the room was thick, as if every word lingered a second too long before dissipating. Caddy, with stiff movements, began to serve the red cabbage. The ladle trembled in her hand, and a few drops of sauce fell onto the tablecloth. No one said anything. No one ever said anything when the mistakes were small. "A little more wine?" Frutos asked, breaking the silence as he lifted the bottle toward Raoul. "No, thank you." Raoul leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. His expression, as closed as his posture, was a clear barrier against any attempt at closeness. "Are we really going to keep pretending this is a normal dinner?" Raoul continued, his tone laced with sarcasm. The clinking of his cutlery against the plate sounded louder than it should have, like a persistent hammering. Caddy glanced nervously at Rodrigo, who was crouched near the fireplace, trying to stoke the flames. Kello lowered her gaze to her plate, playing with food she hadn't touched. "What do you mean by that?" Rodrigo finally asked, not lifting his eyes from the fire. Raoul laughed bitterly, his cold tone contrasting with the warmth of the fire behind him. "That we've been hearing the same thing for 20 years. This might be my last Christmas," she'd say every December, as if it were a prophecy that never came. True. Well, this time it was. So what? Now we're supposed to sit here and cry all night? The comment hit the room like a slap. Kello froze, her face pale as the porcelain plate in front of her. Caddy's eyes filled with tears, but none fell. Rodrigo, on the other hand, stood slowly and turned to Raoul. "How can you say something like that?" His voice was low, contained, but his words carried a weight no one could ignore. "And how can I not?" Raoul raised an eyebrow, defiant. Not everything she did was perfect, or have we already forgotten her endless sermons about how we were supposed to live our lives? Before Rodrigo could respond, Kello stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair in the process. No one stopped her. She crossed the dining room at full speed and disappeared through the door, her sobs echoing down the hallway. "Great job, Raul," Rodrigo snapped as he hurried after her. He found her in the kitchen, leaning against the sink with her hands covering her face. Silent tears fell between her fingers. Rodrigo hesitated for a moment, but finally approached and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Kello," he said softly. She didn't pull away, but she didn't respond either. Rodrigo searched for the right words, something that might comfort her without adding more weight to the moment. Finally, he sighed. "You know it's not easy for any of us. We're all trying to deal with this in our own way." Kello dropped her hands and looked at him with red, swollen eyes. "Deal with it? Is that what we're doing?" She shook her head bitterly. "All we're doing is hurting each other, and she never would have allowed this." Rodrigo nodded thoughtfully. He knew Cello was right. "That's true, but we also know how hard she worked to keep us together. Everything she did for us, even in the hardest moments." Cello lowered her gaze, her shoulders trembling slightly. "I should have helped her more," she murmured. "I knew sometimes she couldn't take it anymore, but I just stood there. I let her carry everything." Rodrigo shook his head and squeezed her shoulder gently. "You did what you could. We all did. And I think she knew that. But now we have to do more. We can't let this family completely fall apart." Kello looked at him, searching for something in his face, perhaps a sign of hope. Rodrigo gave her a sad smile. "Come on, let's go back to the table. We can't let this end like this." Cello nodded weakly. Rodrigo offered her his arm, and together they walked back to the dining room, where the flames in the fireplace danced, as if trying to illuminate the shadow that weighed on them all. The dinner continued in an uneasy back and forth between forced cordiality and loaded silences. Rodrigo barely touched his food. His gaze was lost in the flames of the fireplace, each flicker of light reminding him of the Christmases when he promised to call more often, to be more present, and never followed through. Catty, on the other side of the table, maintained a nervous rhythm of standing up and sitting down, collecting plates that still had food or pouring wine into glasses no one had asked to be filled. Her barely audible voice occasionally asked if anyone needed anything, but she never waited for an answer. Her way of coping with the evening was to stay in motion, because sitting still for too long forced her to think about the impossibility of filling her place. Raul, on the other hand, seemed to find energy in every biting comment he let out. "At least this red cabbage isn't as bad as 2 years ago. That one was inedible," he said, looking at Catty. She glanced up with a hint of reproach, but said nothing. It was Elvie who tried to smooth things over with a nervous laugh. "Well, I don't think this is the time for comparisons, right? We're all doing what we can." Rodrigo set his fork down on his plate with a decisive motion. "I don't understand why you keep acting like this, Raul. You know perfectly well what tonight means to all of us." Raul raised his hands, feigning innocence. "What does it mean, exactly?" a night to pretend we're the perfect family like she liked, because I can assure you that's not going to happen." The words fell like a hard blow on the table. Catty dropped the knife she was cleaning, and Cello let out a deep sigh, bringing a hand to her forehead. "I don't understand why you always have to react like this," Rodrigo said, his tone harsher than usual. He felt the guilt eating away at him, finding an outlet through Raoul. "Maybe if you showed a little more respect for her." Raoul leaned forward, his eyes blazing with contained anger. Respect? What she lacked was realizing that we weren't her personal charity project. Cello dropped her napkin onto her plate with a sharp gesture. "Enough, Raoul. You have no right to talk like that. You don't know everything she did for you. For all of us." Raoul scoffed, but said nothing this time. Rodrigo watched him in silence, wondering if his brother's anger wasn't just pain poorly disguised. Meanwhile, the flames in the fireplace continued to dance, silent witnesses to a broken family trying to find its way in her absence. Cello returned to the dining room with slow steps, carrying a worn-out cardboard box she had found in the attic days earlier, but hadn't had the courage to open until now. She placed the box gently on the table, as if carrying something fragile, and looked at the others with tear-filled eyes. "I found this. I think it's hers," she said in a whisper. Everyone's eyes turned toward the box. The tension in the room became palpable. Catty, trying to keep her composure, began gathering the plates as a pretext to avoid facing its contents. Rodrigo, however, stepped forward and carefully opened the lid. Inside was a small Christmas ornament, a glass sphere with a snowy landscape inside, along with some photographs of past Christmases and a letter carefully folded. Rodrigo took it between his fingers and looked at the others. "It's her handwriting," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. Catty put the plates down on the table and slowly sat down, while Frutos watched in silence. Raoul, his expression still skeptical, leaned his elbows on the table. "And what does it say?" he asked, his tone almost challenging. Rodrigo unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. The first line was simple but direct. "If you're reading this, it means I'm not there to say it myself." The room fell into complete silence. The words seemed to resonate off the walls as Rodrigo continued. "I know Christmas won't be the same without me, but I want you to remember something. Christmas isn't the tree, the lights, or the fire in the fireplace. It's what we share together. It's our story, our moments, our bonds." Frutos closed his eyes for a moment, while Catty began to cry quietly. Raoul, on the other hand, looked away and shook his head. "Of course, it had to be her telling us how to feel. Even now," Raoul murmured, his voice heavy with resentment. "Raoul," Rodrigo began, but he was interrupted. "No, seriously, it's typical. Now we're supposed to pretend everything's fine because she wrote it in a letter." His tone was bitter, but his eyes betrayed something deeper than anger. Cello, who had remained silent until that moment, turned to him. "I don't think she wanted us to pretend. I think she wanted us not to forget, not to let what she built fall apart." Rodrigo carefully folded the letter and placed it on the table. The Christmas ornament seemed to shine faintly under the candlelight, like a fragile symbol of everything that could still hold together. Caddy finally spoke, her voice shaky. Maybe we should try. It won't be the same, but maybe it doesn't have to be the same. Raoul sighed deeply and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He said nothing, but neither did he leave, which in itself was a small victory. Rodrigo sat back down, leaving the letter in the center of the table. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but full of a tacit understanding. The wounds remained open, but for the first time that night, they did not feel insurmountable. The atmosphere, which had only just begun to relax, grew tense again when Rodrigo, staring intently at the letter on the table, decided to speak. She knew it would be her last Christmas, he said softly, as if each word weighed on him. She wrote it here. She didn't want us to fall apart after she was gone. She wanted this. He gestured broadly at the table. To continue existing. Elvie swallowed nervously. Frutos looked toward the fireplace as if trying to escape from what was coming. Raoul, on the other hand, let out a bitter laugh. Of course, now it turns out she was a visionary. She always knew everything, right? The perfect woman. Why don't we say she walked on water too? Caddy looked up, wounded by the sarcasm. Raoul, please. Please what, Caddy? Raoul's voice turned harder. Please don't say what we all know. We treated her like a saint, but how many times did she make us feel like everything we did was wrong? How many times did she meddle in our decisions as if she knew what was best for everyone? That's not fair, Rodrigo interjected, his tone restrained but firm. Not fair? Raoul shot him a piercing look. What's not fair is pretending we never felt suffocated by her, always telling us what to do, how to act, perfect, but incapable of admitting her own mistakes. She wasn't perfect, Raoul, and no one is saying that, Rodrigo replied, rising slightly from his chair. But she did everything she could to keep us together, even when we did nothing to help her. Together. Raoul pounded the table with his fist, making the plates tremble. Together, because she wouldn't let anyone stray from her script. Everything had to be done her way, or it wasn't good enough. Caddy dropped the knife she was holding, the metallic sound piercing the air. Enough, Cello suddenly shouted, her voice trembling from the effort. What do you gain from this, Raoul? What do you gain by attacking her now that she can't defend herself? She was your sister, for God's sake. Raoul stared at her for a moment, his face hardened. But before he could respond, Caddy tried to stand up. In the process, her arm accidentally struck the nativity scene. The baby Jesus, unbalanced, fell to the floor and shattered against the tiles. The sound of porcelain breaking was like a gunshot that silenced everyone. Caddy brought her hands to her mouth, horrified, while Cello took a step back, covering her lips with her hands. Rodrigo slowly bent down to pick up the pieces, his movements cautious, as though afraid that any more noise might shatter something even more fragile. Perfect, Raoul murmured, crossing his arms. Very symbolic, isn't it? That's us too. Broken. Rodrigo looked up at him, but said nothing. His face held a mixture of sadness and exhaustion, a weight that seemed to have accumulated over the years. Caddy collapsed back into her chair, her eyes filled with tears, no one moved for a long minute. The fireplace crackled softly in the background, the only sound in the room. None of them knew what to do with the fragments of the broken baby Jesus or with those that had been exposed between them. The family, at that moment, seemed as irreparable as the porcelain figure shattered on the floor. Rodrigo crouched carefully, picking up the largest fragments of the broken figure. His hands trembled slightly, not so much from the effort, but from the emotional weight of what he held. Caddy, without saying a word, joined him. Soon, Cello and Frutos did the same. All of them bent over the scattered pieces on the floor. Raoul remained in his place, watching them with his arms crossed, but his expression had lost some of its hardness. "We can glue it back together," Cello suggested softly, holding up one of the fragments. Her voice carried a hint of hope, as if the idea was greater than the simple repair of an ornament. Rodrigo looked up and nodded. "Yes, we can try." Caddy let out a long, tired sigh, as if she had been holding back all night. "I have glue in the kitchen. I'll get it." While Caddy disappeared, the others continued gathering the pieces in silence. After a while, Rodrigo spoke, his tone warmer than it had been all evening. "Do you remember how she always insisted on putting up the nativity scene first, even before the tree? She said the baby had to watch us from the very beginning." Cello laughed softly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "And she always placed it in the center of the table, even though it wasn't the most practical spot. She said the baby had to preside no matter where." "She was so serious about those things," added Frutos, smiling faintly, "like when she insisted that we all had to sing carols, even though none of us could carry a tune." Rodrigo picked up a smaller piece from the floor, turning it between his fingers before continuing. "Once she confessed something to me. It was the year I moved to another city for work. She said she was afraid that when she was gone, we would drift so far apart that we wouldn't know how to find each other again." Cello looked up intrigued. "She told you that?" Rodrigo nodded with a melancholic smile. "Yes, but she also said she trusted that in the end we would remember her the right way. She said the bonds between us were stronger than we thought. Sometimes we just needed a little push to remember." Raoul let out a faint sigh from his corner, and although he didn't say anything, his eyes began to soften. Caddy returned with the glue and sat at the table, carefully arranging the pieces. "I think the best way to honor her is to not lose what she taught us," she said as she started to piece together the largest fragments of the baby. Little by little, the others joined in, holding pieces or suggesting how they might fit together. As they worked, the tension seemed to dissipate, replaced by soft laughter and shared memories. "Do you remember how she scolded us if we used colored lights on the tree?" Frutos asked. To her, the white ones were elegant, and the colored ones were a cheap circus. Everyone laughed, even Raoul, who finally leaned toward the table to hold one of the pieces Rodrigo was gluing. "It's true, but in the end, she always let us do whatever we wanted," Raoul said, his tone lower, almost introspective. When they finished, the baby wasn't perfect. The cracks were still visible, but it was whole. Caddy held it in her hands for a moment, then placed it back in the center of the nativity scene. The flames of the fireplace flickered, illuminating it as if celebrating the small triumph of the night. "It's not bad," Raoul murmured, looking at the restored figure. "It's not bad," Cello repeated, with a smile that, for the first time in a long while, seemed sincere. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence filled with shared meanings, as if at that moment words were unnecessary. Rodrigo placed the last pieces of the baby Jesus on the table, and Kalo appeared with a small tube of glue in her hand. Without saying a word, she sat down beside him and began carefully joining the pieces together. Caddy, who until then had stayed on the sidelines, slowly stood and took a seat next to her, observing the process. "Give me a piece," Caddy said, extending her hand. Cello handed her a fragment, and together they began to work in silence, exchanging fleeting glances filled with a mix of sadness and determination. Frutos took a sip of wine and set the glass back on the table gently. "Do you remember when she broke the star for the tree?" he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "She tried to glue it back together with nail polish, and it looked worse. It looked like a star with scars." Elvie's laugh was timid but genuine. "And yet, she still put it on the top of the tree every year," she added. Rodrigo smiled and looked toward the fireplace where the flames danced gently. "She said things with scars were more interesting, that every crack had a story." Raoul, who had remained silent until then, picked up his glass and stared at it pensively. Though he said nothing, his posture had relaxed. For the first time that evening, his brow wasn't furrowed. "You know," Rodrigo said, breaking the moment, "she once told me that she dreamed of us supporting each other like a real family after she was gone. She said she wanted her grandchildren, or any of our children, to grow up knowing they would always have someone to look after them, no matter what." Kalo looked up, her eyes shining. "She always said the small things were what held us together. The dinners, the messages, the birthday calls." Elvie nodded. "Once, she sent me a message at 2 a.m. to remind me I had a dentist appointment. She said that if she didn't, I would definitely forget." Smiles began to appear around the table, timid at first, then more sincere. Raoul, with a long sigh, set his glass down on the table and finally spoke. "She always meddled, it's true, but I suppose she did it because she cared. Maybe more than we understood at the time." Caddy nodded, pressing the last piece of the baby Jesus between her fingers before placing it back in its spot. "She did it because she loved us. Because to her, we were Christmas." The silence that followed was neither uncomfortable nor heavy. It was a silence filled with understanding, with something that, though fragile, was beginning to rebuild itself. The flames from the fireplace lit up everyone's faces, reflecting a warmth they hadn't shared in a long time. Rodrigo took the repaired baby Jesus and carefully placed it back in the nativity scene. Though the cracks were visible, they didn't seem to matter. Somehow they made the figure feel more meaningful. "There it is, like new, or better," he said with a smile. The dinner continued, not as a celebration, but not as the chaos from earlier either. Conversations flowed more softly, with pauses to share anecdotes or simply enjoy each other's company. The fireplace crackled, radiating a warmth that, for the first time that evening, seemed to reach everyone. The dinner had come to an end. The empty plates and remnants of food on the table were witnesses to a night that, though chaotic, had been strangely comforting. Caddy stood up to start clearing the table, but Rodrigo stopped her with a gentle gesture. "Leave it for now," he said softly. "Stay a little longer." Caddy hesitated, but then nodded and sat back down. The fireplace still crackled, casting warm shadows on the walls. Everyone seemed more relaxed, as if the weight of the night had finally lifted. It was Cello who broke the silence first. "Maybe we don't have to keep doing things the way she did," Cello said, her words careful but full of intention. "Maybe it's time we find a way to make this dinner ours. Something that reflects who we are now." Caddy looked up, surprised. She glanced at the others, searching for signs of rejection, but instead found expressions of interest and reflection. "That might work," Caddy murmured. "But it would have to be something we all contribute to. I don't want to feel like I'm trying to be her because I can't. No one can." Rodrigo nodded slowly. "It's not about replacing her. It's about honoring her in a way that connects us to what she wanted, for us to be together." Frutos leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "And how do we do that? Do we just invent something new?" he asked. Not with skepticism, but with genuine curiosity. "We could each bring something personal every year," Rodrigo suggested. "A dish, a memory, a game, something that has meaning for us. That way, it's not just about what we lost, but about what we're building." Raoul, who had remained silent, crossed his arms and sighed. "I don't know if I'm good at those things, but I guess it makes sense, if we all agree." Elvie smiled and shrugged. "I can try to do something, though I won't promise my dish will be edible." The soft laughter that followed was a sign that the idea was taking root. Caddy looked at each of them with a mix of relief and gratitude. "We can start next year," she proposed. "Everyone brings something, and this year—" She paused and looked at the nativity scene with the repaired baby Jesus in the center. "This year, we can leave it at the fact that we managed to be here together. That's enough." Cello smiled and nodded, while Rodrigo stood up to pour one last glass of wine for everyone. He raised his glass and waited for the others to follow suit. "To her, and to us." The toast was simple, but full of meaning. The cracks were still there, like those on the baby Jesus in the nativity scene, but they no longer seemed irreparable. The night, though far from perfect, ended with a promise. They wouldn't let absence define what it meant to be a family. The first year without her was the hardest. Christmas felt like a tightrope, but Caddy's proposal held firm. Each of them contributed something unique. Raoul, albeit reluctantly, made mulled wine that brought back memories of winter afternoons when they would all sit and chat. Cello brought an album filled with old photographs that no one had seen in years. Frutos, with his usual pragmatism, came up with a simple but fun game that sparked unexpected laughter. Rodrigo baked a special bread, saying its scent reminded him of the breakfasts they used to share. As the days passed, the family home began to transform into something more than just a reminder of her absence. Visits, once tense and infrequent, became more regular. Without saying it aloud, they all sought something that reminded them of their shared moments, but not in a sad way. There was a conscious effort to keep alive the bonds she had built. The following Christmas, Caddy's tradition solidified. Instead of sticking to a rigid menu or established activities, each year someone would choose a theme or propose a new idea. That year, Frutos suggested exchanging anecdotes. Everyone had to share a happy memory involving her. Laughter, tears, and knowing looks mingled together, filling the room with a warmth that extended beyond the fire in the fireplace. The house, which had felt so empty during their first gathering without her, became a meeting point. It was no longer a place that evoked sadness, but one that welcomed the renewed joy of the family. The cracks, though still visible, had become part of the design. By the third year, even Raoul, the most skeptical of them all, proposed a detail. He placed an old ornament that she had always used on the mantel, now engraved with the words, "Together, we are Christmas." Though she was no longer there physically, her presence could be felt in every gesture, in every word, in every moment the family shared. But not as a burden, rather as an invisible pillar reminding them that, despite loss and differences, they were still capable of building something beautiful together. In every word, in every moment the family shared. But not as a burden, rather as an invisible pillar reminding them that, despite loss and differences, they were still capable of building something beautiful together.